Why would bakers, the very people who provided the staple of daily life, ever find themselves at the center of violent unrest? In the heart of ancient Rome, bread was more than mere sustenance. It was the lifeblood of the city, a tangible measure of security and status, a daily reminder of the delicate balance between provision and scarcity. Each morning, as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops and cobbled streets, the scent of wheat and baking dough drifted through the city's neighborhoods, promising the comfort of nourishment, but also hinting at the underlying tensions that could erupt if that supply faltered. Bread occupied a unique position in Roman society. For the patricians, it was one component among many in a diet of meats, fruits, and imported delicacies. For the plebeians, it was indispensable, the foundation of meals consumed in small apartments or crowded tenements, where grain porridge or simple loaves often constituted the entirety of daily nutrition. The various types of bread reflected these social divisions. The common panis plebeius, dense and coarse, contrasted sharply with the panis quadratus, carefully scored and baked in uniform squares, or the lighter, more refined panis militaris, intended for soldiers who marched long distances and required sustenance that would not spoil. Rome did not grow enough wheat to satisfy the demands of its ever-expanding population. The city depended heavily on grain imported from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt, regions whose fertile plains could yield large harvests, but whose production and transport were subject to the vagaries of weather, political instability, and piracy. The annona, the state-managed grain supply, was tasked with ensuring that shipments arrived on time, that storage facilities maintained adequate reserves, and that the populace received allocations sufficient to prevent hunger. The arrival of grain fleets at the Tiber's port was an event marked by vigilance and anxiety, for any delay or shortfall could ripple through the city, with consequences felt not just in bakeries, but in the public squares and streets where citizens gathered. Within this system, bakers played a role that was simultaneously economic, practical, and political. They were organized in collegia, trade associations that regulated training, standards, and competition. Bakers were dependent on the price and quality of flour, which fluctuated based on harvest yields and governmental price controls. A sudden increase in the cost of wheat or fuel for ovens could render a bakery unprofitable overnight, forcing bakers to choose between raising prices and risking unrest, or absorbing losses that threatened their livelihoods. In crowded neighborhoods, the aroma of baking bread might inspire comfort in some, but the empty shelves of a poorly stocked bakery could ignite frustration, anger, and eventually action in others. Public policy and politics intertwined closely with bread. The grain dole, or cura annoni, distributed subsidized or free grain to eligible citizens, an attempt by magistrates and emperors to maintain social stability. Yet this system was fragile. Bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption, and the sheer logistical difficulty of feeding hundreds of thousands of residents meant that shortages were frequent. When scarcity struck, prices rose, and the burden of supply often fell disproportionately on bakers, who were expected to deliver bread at regulated prices while managing rising costs for raw materials and labor. Such pressures, recurring over generations, created an environment ripe for confrontation. Riots were rarely spontaneous expressions of discontent. They were often the inevitable outcome of cumulative stress in the marketplace, where economic, social, and political pressures converged in the tangible form of a loaf of bread. The earliest recorded unrest over grain illustrates this dynamic. In 494 BCE, plebeians staged a secession to the Mons Sacer, protesting not only political inequalities, but also inequities in access to food. Grain shortages, whether caused by poor harvests, hoarding, or inequitable distribution, were experienced directly by the population and symbolically by bakers, who bore the immediate responsibility for meeting demand. The pattern repeated in later centuries. During the late Republic, grain imports were disrupted by civil wars, and bakers, already stretched by state-imposed obligations, found themselves caught between authorities demanding provision at low cost and citizens demanding affordable sustenance. The practical realities of a baker's work intensified these pressures. The preparation of bread required early hours, precise measurements, and constant attention to the fermentation of dough. Roman mills were powered by animals or water, and the act of grinding grain into flour was labor-intensive, noisy, and dusty. Ovens, often shared among several bakers, consumed large amounts of wood and generated oppressive heat. In such conditions, bakers were acutely aware of both the fragility of supply chains and the immediacy of customer expectation. A single miscalculation, a delayed shipment of flour, a poorly timed oven fire, could result in unsold bread, angry customers, and scrutiny from officials tasked with maintaining public order. Bread shortages had consequences that extended beyond the bakery. Citizens gathered in forums and marketplaces, murmuring and protesting when shelves were empty. Street demonstrations could escalate quickly, fueled by frustration, hunger, and the visible presence of bakers who were perceived as both essential providers and gatekeepers of sustenance. Emperors and magistrates were not passive observers. They deployed troops, intervened with emergency grain distributions, and occasionally reformed regulations to stabilize prices. Yet despite these measures, the recurring pattern of scarcity, social anxiety, and economic strain ensured that bakers remained central actors in one of Rome's most persistent forms of civil unrest. Rome's appetite for grain extended far beyond what the Italian peninsula could provide, and as the population swelled, the city became increasingly dependent on distant territories. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Delta, Sicily, and the provinces of North Africa, supplied the bulk of wheat that filled the Annona. Grain fleets set out from these regions months in advance, guided by careful planning and celestial navigation, but their arrival was never guaranteed. Storms in the Mediterranean could scatter ships across hundreds of miles, while pirates along key sea lanes threatened to seize or destroy entire cargoes. For bakers in the city, every shipment that arrived late or was partially lost represented not merely inconvenience, but a tangible threat to livelihood. Without flour, ovens cooled, and hungry citizens wandered the streets seeking sustenance that might not exist. The administration of the grain supply was a monumental task, handled with a combination of bureaucracy and military oversight. Officials, known as curatores, Annoni managed the distribution, maintaining warehouses near the Tiber and in various districts to ensure access across the sprawling urban landscape. Records meticulously tracked quantities, prices, and recipients, yet gaps and errors were inevitable. Spoiled grain, theft, or misallocation could ripple through the system, affecting bakers and consumers alike. Even when deliveries arrived intact, The conversion of bulk wheat into consumable bread required skill, labor, and coordination. Skills that not all bakers possessed in equal measure. These logistical challenges created a tension-laden environment in which the failure of any single component could have consequences for thousands of residents. The economic pressures on bakers were considerable. Flour constituted the primary raw material, but fuel for ovens, labor for kneading and milling, and rent for workshop spaces added to the financial burden. Price controls imposed by magistrates or emperors limited how much bakers could charge, even during times of scarcity. A rise in wheat prices, whether due to a poor harvest in Sicily or political unrest in Egypt, translated directly into either losses for bakers or increased risk of social unrest if prices were raised. The delicate balance between cost, availability, and public expectation was one that could be easily disrupted, and disruptions often triggered tension not only in the marketplace, but across the city's streets. Public dissatisfaction with bread shortages was expressed most clearly through unrest, which ranged from quiet grumbling to outright riots. In 494 BCE, for instance, the secession of the plebeians to the Mons Sacer reflected grievances over political representation and, critically, access to grain. These early protests illustrated a recurring pattern. When citizens faced scarcity, bakers, as the most visible intermediaries between supply and consumption, bore the brunt of blame. Later, during the late Republic, Rome experienced additional episodes of unrest when grain imports were interrupted by civil wars or piracy, further demonstrating the interdependence of economic, social, and political factors. Bakers were caught in the middle, expected to provide consistent service under conditions that were often unpredictable and perilous. The daily life of a baker was demanding, governed by the rhythm of sunrise and the constraints of equipment and space. Roman mills ground grain, using stone wheels powered by water or animals, producing flour that was coarse by modern standards and required careful handling to prevent spoilage. Dough was kneaded by hand in large wooden troughs, with attention paid to hydration, fermentation, and texture. Ovens, often heated by wood-fired braziers, consumed both time and energy. Controlling the temperature was an art that required experience and careful observation. Sensory elements dominated the work environment. The smell of freshly ground flour, the heat radiating from brick ovens, the tactile resistance of dough beneath skilled hands, and the constant sounds of milling, grinding, and kneading. In these conditions, bakers were acutely aware that any error could produce substandard bread, provoke complaints, or contribute to public discontent. Political considerations further complicated the situation. The grain dole, implemented as part of the Cura Annoni, sought to provide citizens with subsidized or free grain, yet distribution was never uniform. Magistrates and later emperors used grain as a means of political leverage, offering extra rations to curry favor or maintain order, and sometimes withholding supplies to punish dissent. The result was a precarious equilibrium. Bakers were responsible not only for economic survival, but also for participating in a political system that used bread as a mechanism of control. Riots, therefore, were not simply expressions of hunger. They were manifestations of cumulative strain in an environment where the production and distribution of a single commodity could influence the stability of an entire city. Historical records provide vivid examples of this precarious balance. During the reign of Nero in the 1st century CE, bread shortages contributed to unrest in Rome, prompting emergency measures such as the distribution of grain from state reserves and the importation of additional shipments from Africa. Similarly, under Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century CE, disruptions in grain shipments led to public agitation, with bakeries frequently becoming focal points for complaints. In these episodes, bakers were thrust into the center of civic life, their work both vital and perilous, their daily decisions echoing across the densely packed streets of Rome. The streets of Rome were crowded and narrow, lined with insula that housed hundreds of residents, each reliant on a dependable supply of bread to sustain life. When that supply faltered, discontent could ignite swiftly. One documented incident from the early imperial period illustrates the precarious relationship between bakers, citizens, and authorities. During a time of particularly poor harvests in Sicily, delays in grain shipments led to shortages in the city. Citizens queued at bakeries from dawn, their voices rising in complaint when ovens remained empty. Bakers, already strained by the increased cost of imported wheat, were confronted not only with material scarcity, but also with the judgment and anger of the public. These tensions, compounded over days, escalated into open unrest. Stones were thrown, shops were overturned, and magistrates dispatched guards to restore order. In these moments, bakers occupied a unique position, essential to survival, yet visible as intermediaries through whom the failures of supply were interpreted and felt. The Roman government attempted to mitigate such crises through regulation and oversight. Price ceilings for bread were periodically enforced, and magistrates monitored bakeries to ensure compliance. Yet the practical enforcement of these regulations often proved uneven. Officials relied on reports from city inspectors who could be bribed, delayed, or simply ineffective. Bakers who attempted to comply while covering rising costs faced the impossible choice of incurring financial loss or risking the ire of customers and authorities alike. The constant negotiation between material reality and legal expectation shaped every day of a baker's work, creating an environment in which tension was always present, even in moments of apparent calm. Historical accounts of riots illustrate the variety of circumstances under which unrest occurred. In 33 CE, during the reign of Tiberius, a disruption in grain deliveries from Africa prompted protests among the plebeian population. Bakers were at the forefront, both as witnesses to anger and as participants in the struggle for survival. Their workshops, ovens, and sacks of flour became focal points in a broader civic crisis. Officials responded by organizing emergency distributions, redirecting ships laden with grain, and attempting to negotiate with guild leaders. The intricate choreography of supply, politics, and social expectation was evident. The city's stability hinged on a commodity as simple and essential as wheat. Within their bakeries, artisans and laborers faced relentless demands. Flour dust coated the air, settling on faces and clothing, while the heat from ovens intensified during the long hours of kneading and baking. Each loaf required careful attention to ensure consistent quality, lest a batch be rejected by customers or inspected officials. The repetitive motions of mixing, folding, and shaping dough were physically exhausting, yet precision was necessary. Poorly baked bread could spoil quickly, and in a city where scarcity could lead to unrest, the consequences were tangible and immediate. In this environment, bakers were both craftsmen and caretakers, sustaining the populace while negotiating the limitations of resources and time. Bakers' guilds, or collegia, played a critical role in regulating the profession and defending the interests of their members. These associations provided training, established standards for baking, and occasionally intervened in disputes over pricing or supply. Membership afforded some protection, particularly in negotiations with magistrates, but guilds could not eliminate the systemic pressures that threatened individual bakeries. The combination of political interference, fluctuating supply, and public expectation meant that even the most skilled bakers were vulnerable to crises beyond their control. The recurring pattern of scarcity, coupled with economic and social pressures, created conditions under which the smallest disruption could precipitate unrest. Emperors and magistrates recognized the importance of stabilizing bread supply as a matter of statecraft. The annona was expanded, warehouses were increased in number and capacity, and grain fleets were dispatched with greater frequency. In some cases, emergency measures included importing bread or flour from distant provinces to alleviate shortages. Yet despite these interventions, bakeries remained central to the perception of order. A city full of grain but unable to convert it into bread faced the same risk of unrest as a city entirely bereft of supplies. Bakers, therefore, were simultaneously beneficiaries of imperial attention and the first point of contact for citizens' grievances. The cultural significance of bread extended beyond mere sustenance. Citizens recognized bread as a symbol of stability and social cohesion. A well-stocked bakery, the aroma of fresh loaves, and the orderly distribution of grain represented a city functioning effectively. Conversely, empty ovens and rising prices symbolized vulnerability and neglect. Bakers, through their labor, influenced not only the nourishment of the population, but also the perception of governmental competence. In moments of scarcity, the responsibility borne by bakers was both practical and symbolic, placing them at the intersection of economic reality, social expectation, and political authority. During periods of civil unrest, bakers sometimes joined the populace in expressing frustration or advocating for change. The most documented examples involve coordinated strikes or temporary cessation of baking, actions that directly impacted the supply chain and forced authorities to respond. Such actions were not acts of rebellion for their own sake, but responses to systemic pressures. Delayed grain shipments, excessive taxation, or restrictive price controls that threatened the viability of their livelihoods. In effect, the baker became both a participant in and a reflection of societal tension, embodying the precarious balance of provision and expectation that underpinned urban life in Rome. Throughout Rome's history, episodes of unrest surrounding bread were numerous and varied, reflecting the city's dependence on grain, the vulnerability of supply chains, and the pressures faced by bakers. One notable instance occurred in 33 CE under Tiberius, when delayed grain shipments from Africa left many neighborhoods in disarray. Citizens gathered near bakeries and marketplaces, their frustration growing as loaves became scarce. Some bakers attempted to ration bread themselves, distributing smaller portions to preserve stock. But these efforts were often misunderstood or disregarded by a populace accustomed to specific allocations. Magistrates intervened, dispatching guards to maintain order and organizing emergency shipments. But the tension lingered. leaving a lasting impression of both the fragility and centrality of the baking trade in civic life. The imperial period saw additional unrest linked to bread shortages. During Nero's reign, disruptions caused by poor harvests and logistical mishaps prompted widespread dissatisfaction. Bakers were again at the center of public attention, their shops becoming gathering points for citizens expressing grievances. In some districts, riots escalated into damage to property, overturned carts, and the temporary closure of bakeries. Authorities responded with emergency grain distributions and the establishment of temporary baking facilities. But the events underscored a fundamental truth. The city's social and political stability depended not only on the presence of grain, but on its transformation into bread through the skill and labor of bakers. Economic pressures compounded these risks. Flour prices fluctuated with harvest yields, transport costs, and imperial levies. Fuel for ovens, whether wood or charcoal, added an additional financial burden. Bakers employed apprentices, laborers, and millers, whose wages had to be covered regardless of supply disruptions. When shortages occurred, bakers faced the difficult choice of absorbing losses or raising prices, each decision carrying consequences. Public perception was immediate and often unforgiving. Citizens interpreted price increases as greed or negligence, while officials viewed shortages as failures of compliance. In this precarious balance, bakers were simultaneously indispensable and vulnerable, their craft entwined with the broader currents of urban life and political power. Daily life within bakeries reflected these pressures in tangible ways. Ovens required careful tending, often stoked from early morning until late afternoon. Dough had to be kneaded with precision, mixed and folded according to established methods that ensured consistency and quality. The air was thick with the smell of flour and yeast, dust settling on skin and clothing. Bakers worked tirelessly, aware that any failure could trigger dissatisfaction, complaints, or even violence. Apprentices assisted with repetitive tasks while senior bakers maintained oversight, monitoring fermentation times, oven temperatures, and the distribution of finished loaves. Each loaf produced represented both a practical contribution to nourishment and a symbolic assurance of order, connecting the labor of one workshop to the well-being of thousands of city residents. Guilds, or collegia, played a significant role in mediating between bakers, officials, and the public. These organizations established standards for baking, regulated apprenticeship, and occasionally represented the collective interests of members in disputes over price or supply. Membership offered a measure of protection, particularly when magistrates attempted to enforce price ceilings or oversee rationing. Yet guilds could not remove the inherent vulnerabilities baked into the system. Each crisis, whether caused by harvest failure, transport delays, or political upheaval, was experienced immediately by bakers and felt symbolically by the citizens who depended on them. The guild structure, while providing some organization, could not prevent the emergence of unrest when scarcity intersected with economic and social pressures. Historical records reveal that even minor fluctuations in supply could have cascading effects. During the reign of Septimius Severus, for instance, disruptions in shipments from North Africa prompted both complaints from citizens and complaints from bakers, who struggled to maintain production under unpredictable circumstances. Officials deployed emergency measures, including the temporary establishment of communal ovens and the redistribution of stored grain, yet the underlying vulnerabilities remained. Such episodes highlight the delicate interdependence of government, bakers, and the public, illustrating how the management of a single commodity, bread, was essential to the functioning of an empire. Beyond immediate survival, bread carried cultural and symbolic significance. Its availability signified stability, civic order, and the competence of leadership. Citizens took notice of empty shelves or delayed distributions, interpreting these as signals of neglect or mismanagement. Bakers, through their work, directly influenced this perception. The act of producing bread became both a practical labor and a civic duty. In moments of scarcity, the decisions of a single baker, how much to ration, when to bake, how to distribute loaves, could reverberate across neighborhoods, shaping both the experience of hunger and the perception of authority. The baker's craft, therefore, was inseparable from the broader rhythms of urban life and the maintenance of social equilibrium. Occasionally, bakers themselves took action when pressures became unsustainable. Coordinated strikes, temporary cessation of production, or refusal to adhere to price controls were not uncommon in times of extreme stress. These measures were pragmatic responses to the risks inherent in their profession. Financial ruin, public hostility, and legal consequences all loomed as potential outcomes of mismanaged supply. By asserting control over production, bakers could influence both the market and political response, highlighting their essential position within the urban economy. Yet such interventions were fraught with risk, illustrating the constant negotiation between survival, duty, and the demands of a densely populated city. By the 1st century CE, the management of grain and bread had become a matter of both civic necessity and imperial concern. The annona was expanded to accommodate the city's growing population, and magistrates closely monitored the arrival and distribution of shipments. Despite these efforts, shortages persisted, often triggered by factors far beyond the control of individual bakers. A poor harvest in Sicily could take months to impact Rome, yet when it did, the effects were immediate. Queues formed outside bakeries, tempers frayed, and the pressure on bakers intensified. In these moments, the work of converting grain into bread assumed a heightened importance, each loaf representing not only nourishment, but a measure of social stability. Emperors recognized this delicate balance. Claudius, for instance, implemented measures to streamline grain imports and expand storage facilities, aiming to prevent the recurrence of unrest. Nero intervened directly during crises, organizing emergency distributions and occasionally subsidizing bakeries to ensure production continued despite shortages. The presence of imperial oversight, however, could not eliminate the human and logistical challenges inherent in baking. Bakers still faced fluctuating costs, inconsistent deliveries, and the demands of a population for whom bread was indispensable. Their position, therefore, remained both central and precarious, caught between political authority and public expectation. Social pressures were equally significant. Bread was consumed by all strata of society, and its availability influenced the perception of fairness and justice. When loaves were scarce or of inferior quality, citizens interpreted this as a failure of leadership, a breach of the social contract, and in some cases, a personal affront. Public protests often targeted bakeries directly as visible points of failure within the broader system. Stones were thrown, ovens were sabotaged, and in extreme cases, bakers were physically threatened. These episodes illustrate the immediate human consequences of economic and logistical failures, showing how the act of baking, a routine, daily labor, was tightly interwoven with the maintenance of civic harmony. Bakers themselves responded pragmatically to these pressures. The organization of labor within bakeries was highly structured. Apprentices and laborers handled repetitive or strenuous tasks, while experienced bakers monitored fermentation, mixing, and baking. Efficiency and quality control were essential, as errors could result in spoilage or public dissatisfaction. Guilds continued to provide oversight and advocacy, ensuring that standards were maintained and that members received some protection in disputes with authorities or the populace. Yet even with these structures in place, bakers were acutely aware of the fragility of their position. A single misstep, a delayed shipment, or a sudden increase in demand could threaten both livelihoods and public order. Instances of unrest illustrate the consequences of failure in the system. During the reign of Domitian, for example, a delayed shipment of wheat from Egypt coincided with poor local harvests, resulting in widespread dissatisfaction. Bakeries became focal points of protest, with citizens expressing frustration at perceived hoarding or price manipulation. Officials intervened by distributing reserves from imperial warehouses and temporarily opening additional public ovens. Yet the events highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in the urban food supply chain. Bakers, as the intermediaries through which grain became bread, bore the brunt of public scrutiny while simultaneously shouldering the labor of production. Economic realities compounded the challenge. Flour prices varied according to harvest yields, transport expenses, and market speculation, while fuel for ovens represented a continual cost. Labor had to be compensated, equipment maintained, and apprentices trained, all under the watchful eye of officials enforcing price controls. In this context, bakers had to navigate a complex interplay of resource management, technical skill, and social responsibility. Their work was simultaneously artisanal, economic, and civic, demanding both physical endurance and a careful awareness of the broader social and political environment. Cultural significance also played a role in shaping reactions to bread scarcity. A well-stocked bakery symbolized order, competence, and the provision of essential needs, while empty shelves or irregular distributions suggested instability and neglect. Citizens' perception of bakeries as both providers and indicators of governance elevated the stakes of daily labor. Every loaf was not merely food, but a marker of social continuity, a visible proof of the city's ability to sustain its population. In times of scarcity, bakers' decisions about rationing, production, and allocation carried weight far beyond the walls of their workshops, influencing public sentiment and, in some cases, determining the course of civic unrest. Throughout the empire, authorities adapted to these pressures with varying degrees of success. Emergency distributions, temporary price subsidies, and expanded warehouse capacity were employed to maintain supply and prevent social disruption. Bakers, while central to these efforts, remained vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of weather, transportation, and demand. Their work embodied the intersection of labor, economy, and governance, illustrating how a simple commodity, bread, could serve as both sustenance and a barometer of civic stability. In this way, the history of Roman bakers and bread riots reveals a complex interplay of human skill, resource management, and social expectation, highlighting the enduring significance of ordinary labor in maintaining extraordinary urban systems. During the reign of Antoninus Pius, Rome experienced one of its quieter periods, yet even then, the dependence on grain imports could not be ignored. Shipments from Sicily and Africa arrived with clockwork regularity most years, but delays caused by storms or bureaucratic inefficiency were inevitable. When such delays occurred, bakeries became the first visible sign of disruption. Citizens, accustomed to consistent daily rations, would arrive at shops only to find empty shelves. The air was thick with the mingling sense of anticipation and disappointment. The smell of flour in storage, lingering traces of yesterday's baking, and the faint tang of yeast and dough that had risen but remained unbaked. In these moments, the work of a baker was not only a matter of skill, but of social responsibility, as each loaf represented sustenance for a community dependent on reliability. Bakers responded to these pressures with careful rationing, adjusting the size of loaves or delaying the release of freshly baked bread until all portions could be distributed equitably. Apprentices measured flour and water with precision, monitoring fermentation times under the supervision of senior bakers. The ovens radiated an intense, dry heat, and the rhythmic pounding of dough against wooden tables echoed through the workshops. Each sensory detail was a reminder of the labor-intensive nature of bread production. The coarse texture of whole grain flour, the elasticity of kneaded dough, the sharp tang of sourdough fermenting over hours. In this environment, mistakes were costly. A loaf baked too long or too briefly could not be sold, potentially inflaming public dissatisfaction and drawing the attention of magistrates tasked with enforcing price controls. Political oversight remained a constant influence. The annona was administered to ensure that grain flowed consistently to Rome's populace, but officials often relied on bakers themselves to manage the distribution effectively. Price ceilings were enforced, and deviations could be met with sanctions. This created a delicate balance. Bakers had to maintain profitability while ensuring compliance with regulations, a task complicated by fluctuations in import prices and transport costs. Guilds offered some support, providing standardized practices and advocating for members during disputes, yet no organization could shield an individual baker entirely from the consequences of scarcity or mismanagement. Several recorded incidents illustrate the tension inherent in this system. During the mid-2nd century CE, a delayed wheat shipment led to protests in multiple districts. Citizens gathered at bakery doors, pressing for loaves that did not exist, while bakers, working tirelessly in sweltering conditions, attempted to distribute whatever bread remained. Officials intervened, organizing emergency distributions and ordering temporary expansions of oven capacity. Yet the unrest underscored the fragile interconnection between supply, labor, and civic order. Bakers stood at the center of this delicate ecosystem, their daily labor bridging the physical and social necessities of the city. The economic environment exacerbated these pressures. Wheat prices fluctuated according to harvest yields, transportation costs, and speculative markets. Fuel for ovens, often wood or charcoal, added continual expense. Apprentices, millers, and other laborers required compensation, and equipment maintenance was ongoing. These factors created an environment in which bakers had to balance operational costs with public demand, frequently under the scrutiny of officials enforcing regulations. Even a minor miscalculation in production could cascade into financial loss and social discontent, emphasizing the precarious nature of their work. Cultural expectations further heighten these dynamics. Bread was not merely food, it was a symbol of civic stability, a tangible representation of the city's capacity to sustain its population. A consistent supply reinforced confidence in governance, while shortages could provoke anxiety, unrest, and public criticism. Bakers, through their labor and decisions, influenced both the material and symbolic well-being of Rome. Their actions or inactions were interpreted as reflections of civic competence, making the daily task of kneading, baking, and distributing bread a matter of social significance as well as practical necessity. By the late imperial period, the interplay between bakers, citizens, and government had evolved into a complex system of interdependence. Authorities increasingly relied on guilds and workshop networks to stabilize supply, while bakers developed sophisticated routines for rationing and production. Despite these advancements, the potential for disruption remained. Floods, poor harvests, transport failures, or political unrest could interrupt grain shipments, triggering anxiety and occasional disturbances. Bakers, situated at the intersection of production, distribution, and social expectation, continued to play a vital role, their craft embodying both the practical and symbolic essence of urban life. Across these centuries, one constant remained: the centrality of bread to the rhythm of Rome. Each loaf represented the culmination of labor, planning, and social coordination, a small but essential contribution to the functioning of a vast and complex city. The work of bakers, often overlooked in ordinary accounts of history, was in fact pivotal to maintaining social equilibrium. When the system faltered, whether due to natural, economic, or political causes, their labor, and sometimes their protest, became a flashpoint, highlighting the profound interconnection between sustenance, civic responsibility, and public order. By the late 3rd century CE, Rome faced increasing pressures from internal instability and external threats, and the city's dependence on imported grain became ever more pronounced. Shipments from Africa and Sicily remained critical, but the dangers of piracy, storm damage, and logistical inefficiency threatened the consistency of supply. Bakers, who had long operated within a framework of guild oversight and imperial regulation, now faced heightened uncertainty. Delays or shortfalls meant that families went hungry, customers grew impatient, and magistrates scrutinized workshops for compliance. In these conditions, the labor of baking assumed an acute significance. Each loaf represented both the sustenance of households and the maintenance of social cohesion within the city. The daily life of bakers during these times remained strenuous. Apprentices rose before dawn to prepare flour and water, checking the consistency and fermentation of dough while supervising junior laborers in kneading and shaping. Ovens radiated oppressive heat, the air thick with flour dust, yeast, and the earthy scent of baked bread. Senior bakers monitored each stage carefully, understanding that an uneven loaf could prompt dissatisfaction, complaints, or official scrutiny. The sensory environment, the smell of yeast, the warmth of the ovens, the texture of dough under skilled hands, was inseparable from the pressures of maintaining supply under unstable conditions. Mistakes were costly not only economically, but socially, as shortages could provoke unrest, and every loaf carried the weight of civic expectation. Family life intersected with this labor-intensive work. Many bakers operated family-run workshops, with wives, children, and extended relatives assisting in mixing, kneading, or packaging bread for sale. These households were inseparable from the bakery itself, with ovens and storage areas often located within the home. The heat, noise, and constant activity influenced daily rhythms, shaping the lives of all household members. In times of scarcity, families experienced stress alongside their workers, sharing both the physical labor of production and the anxiety associated with meeting public demand. The boundaries between work, home, and civic responsibility blurred, illustrating the all-encompassing nature of the baking trade in urban Rome. Political and administrative oversight remained central. Magistrates, charged with maintaining social order, inspected bakeries, monitored prices, and ensured compliance with regulations. The annona continued to coordinate grain imports and distribution, employing warehouses and emergency measures when shipments were delayed. Nevertheless, these interventions could not eliminate the inherent vulnerabilities of the system. A delayed ship from Africa, a poor Sicilian harvest, or a localized transport failure could cascade through the city, disrupting bakeries, aggravating citizens, and forcing rapid governmental responses. Bakers, as intermediaries, bore the immediate impact of these disruptions while simultaneously sustaining essential urban life. Documented instances of unrest demonstrate the recurring patterns of crisis. In one late 3rd century episode, a series of delayed shipments coincided with poor local grain harvests, leading to protests in multiple districts. Citizens gathered outside bakeries, demanding loaves that did not exist. Bakers attempted rationing and carefully timed distributions, yet tensions escalated. Magistrates dispatched guards, opened emergency grain stores, and organized temporary bakeries to alleviate the shortage. These events exemplify the precarious position of bakers. Their labor was essential, their actions highly visible, and the consequences of scarcity immediate and potentially severe. Economic pressures continued to challenge bakers' resilience. Flour prices fluctuated with harvest conditions, transport costs, and imperial levies. Fuel for ovens, wood, charcoal, or peat added constant expense. Laborers and apprentices required compensation, and workshops required maintenance. All of these costs had to be balanced against price ceilings enforced by magistrates and the expectations of a population accustomed to reliable, daily rations. Bakers operated under a constant tension between profitability and public responsibility, a balance that could be disrupted by factors far beyond their control. Guilds provided some stability, coordinating labor, establishing standards, and advocating for members in disputes with authorities. Yet even within these protective structures, bakers were acutely aware of the fragility of their work. The failure to produce sufficient bread could trigger unrest, attract scrutiny, and endanger livelihoods. The recurring crises of supply highlighted the complex interdependence of labor, governance, and public expectation. Bakers' actions, or inactions, reflected not only technical skill, but also the social and political fabric of the city, emphasizing the significance of an occupation often overlooked in historical narratives. The cultural weight of bread remained undiminished. Consistent supply signified stability, competence, and civic order. Scarcity suggested failure, neglect, or even injustice. Citizens interpreted shortages in light of governance, while bakers themselves navigated the pressures of providing sustenance and sustaining social equilibrium. Each loaf represented a nexus of labor, economy, and civic life. The act of baking, therefore, transcended its practical function, embodying both material necessity and symbolic importance within the densely populated, politically intricate environment of Rome. In this context, bread riots were both predictable and instructive. They revealed vulnerabilities in supply chains, highlighted tensions between authorities and citizens, and demonstrated the centrality of bakers in maintaining civic order. Riots were rarely acts of spontaneous chaos. They were the culmination of economic, social, and political stresses, mediated through the daily reality of producing, distributing, and rationing bread. Bakers, caught between demand and limitation, became both agents and symbols within these crises, illustrating the profound interconnection between ordinary labor and extraordinary social consequence. In the later 4th century CE, Rome continued to experience pressures on its food supply as population growth, political instability, and logistical challenges intersected to create recurrent scarcity. Delayed shipments from North Africa, combined with local crop failures, produced tensions that were felt first and most acutely in bakeries. Citizens, expecting their daily ration of bread, gathered in long lines at shop doors, the low murmur of complaint growing steadily into more vocal protest. Bakers, already familiar with the pressures of timing, measurement, and distribution, found themselves negotiating not only the practical challenges of production, but also the heightened expectations of a restless population. Each loaf represented both nourishment and social stability, and any failure could provoke dissatisfaction or unrest. The administration of the grain supply, though increasingly sophisticated, remained susceptible to disruption. Officials maintained warehouses throughout the city, coordinated the arrival of grain fleets, and monitored local distribution to ensure compliance with price regulations. Guilds played an increasingly important role, standardizing practices and mediating disputes between bakers and authorities. These associations established rules for apprenticeships, quality standards, and methods of rationing in times of scarcity, aiming to maintain both fairness and reliability. Nevertheless, bakers remained vulnerable. Transport delays, fluctuating costs, and unpredictable demand could disrupt production despite adherence to all prescribed procedures. Daily life in bakeries during these times was arduous and precise. Apprentices and laborers worked in close quarters, measuring flour and water with care, kneading dough until it reached the correct elasticity, and monitoring fermentation times to ensure optimal quality. The ovens emitted intense heat, and the air was dense with flour dust, yeast, and the lingering smell of baking bread. Senior bakers oversaw these processes, making split-second decisions that could affect both the success of the batch and the satisfaction of the community. Even minor errors, a loaf slightly underbaked or too dense, could provoke complaints from customers and draw scrutiny from officials, illustrating the precarious position of bakers within the city's social and economic ecosystem. The economic environment continued to impose constraints. Wheat prices fluctuated according to harvest yields, shipping costs, and levies, while fuel for ovens remained a constant expenditure. Laborers and apprentices required wages, and equipment required maintenance, creating a complex set of operational considerations. Price controls enforced by magistrates limited revenue, forcing bakers to carefully balance cost, productivity, and public expectation. Guild oversight provided some stability and guidance, but the overarching pressures of supply, demand, and social responsibility persisted. Historical incidents illuminate the consequences of disruption. During a late 4th century shortage, reports indicate that citizens in multiple districts of Rome assembled outside bakeries, demanding loaves that were unavailable. Bakers attempted rationing, carefully measuring portions to ensure equitable distribution, but frustrations quickly escalated. Magistrates responded with emergency grain releases, temporary expansions of baking facilities, and enforcement of public order. These events reveal a recurring pattern: the baker as an essential laborer, the loaf as a marker of civic stability, and the bakery as the visible interface between state infrastructure and daily life. Bread's cultural significance reinforced its role in these dynamics. Consistent supply and high-quality loaves were interpreted as evidence of effective governance, while shortages suggested neglect or incompetence. Citizens experienced hunger not only as a physical deprivation, but also as a social and political signal, observing the responsiveness of both bakers and magistrates. Bakers, aware of the symbolic weight of their craft, operated with an acute consciousness of the consequences of failure. Each loaf carried not only the practical requirement of sustenance, but also the intangible weight of civic perception and social expectation. The culmination of these pressures sometimes manifested in coordinated action by bakers themselves. Strikes, temporary halts in production, and appeals to guild authorities were employed as pragmatic measures to manage untenable circumstances. These interventions were not acts of defiance for their own sake. They reflected the complex interplay of economic necessity, labor responsibility, and civic expectation. Bakers, situated at the intersection of labor, governance, and public welfare, thus emerged not only as providers of essential nourishment, but also as active participants in the maintenance and negotiation of social order. Across centuries, Rome's experience with bread demonstrates the delicate balance required to sustain a vast urban population. The labor of bakers, often physically exhausting and painstakingly precise, was central to this equilibrium. Their daily work, conducted amid heat, dust, and constant vigilance, had consequences that rippled outward into public perception, civic stability, and political authority. Riots and unrest, though frequently chronicled as isolated incidents, were in reality the predictable outcome of systemic pressures on a city whose survival depended on the timely and consistent production of a single staple. In understanding the role of bakers, one appreciates not only the technical skill of their craft, but also the social and political significance embedded in each loaf. As the 5th century approached, Rome faced mounting pressures from both internal and external forces. Yet the basic rhythm of urban life still revolved around the steady provision of bread. Grain imports remained vital, yet increasingly precarious. Storms, piracy, and political instability disrupted shipments, while local harvests occasionally failed, creating tension that first became visible at bakeries. Citizens arrived at shops expecting a daily ration, and when supply faltered, frustration grew. Bakers, experienced in the delicate balance of production, distribution, and rationing, faced the dual challenge of meeting material need and sustaining civic order. Each loaf represented a tangible connection between ordinary labor and the broader social fabric, linking the workshop to neighborhoods across the city. Baker guilds, long established, adapted to these pressures by refining practices, codifying methods, and providing support to members during crises. Apprentices were trained meticulously, learning not only the technical skills of kneading, fermenting, and baking, but also the procedures for rationing and managing limited supplies. Guild oversight helped maintain standards, coordinate labor, and advocate on behalf of bakers with magistrates. Yet even these structures could not eliminate the fundamental vulnerabilities posed by disruptions in the supply chain. The interdependence of grain importation, bakery labor, and civic stability remained a constant, emphasizing how the labor of a single workshop could influence life throughout the city. Historical accounts from this period record episodes in which bread shortages led to unrest, particularly during times of compounded stress, such as poor harvests coinciding with political instability. Citizens gathered outside bakeries, demanding loaves that did not exist. Bakers employed rationing, time distributions, and careful measurement to maintain equity. But tensions frequently escalated. Magistrates intervened, dispatching guards, opening emergency stores, and sometimes establishing temporary baking facilities. These events illustrate a recurring theme. Bakeries were the visible interface between state infrastructure and citizen satisfaction, and the labor of bakers became a focal point through which both material need and social expectation were expressed. The sensory environment of the bakery continued to be defined by its intensity. Flour dust hovered in the air, settling on skin, hair, and clothing. The heat of wood-fired ovens radiated through tightly confined spaces, and the scent of fermenting dough and freshly baked bread permeated every corner. Laborers and apprentices moved in rhythm, mixing, kneading, and shaping under the watchful eye of senior bakers. Each step required precision and attention, as errors could produce inedible or unsellable loaves. In this environment, bakers' work was simultaneously physical, technical, and social, connecting the act of baking to the broader rhythms of civic life. Economic pressures remained an ever-present concern. Wheat prices fluctuated based on harvest quality, transport costs, and imperial levies. Fuel, labor, and equipment maintenance further complicated calculations. Price ceilings enforced by magistrates constrained revenue, creating a delicate balance between operational sustainability and compliance. Bakers navigated these challenges while remaining attentive to public expectation, recognizing that their work had implications not only for their livelihood, but for social stability. Their labor thus embodied both practical skill and civic responsibility, a dual role that persisted across centuries. The cultural and social significance of bread reinforced its centrality. Reliable supply and high-quality loaves were markers of effective governance, while shortages were interpreted as failures of leadership. Citizens experienced scarcity as both a physical and symbolic deprivation, observing not only the absence of sustenance, but also the responsiveness of authorities and bakers. Bakers, aware of this perception, managed distribution carefully, understanding that their work had consequences far beyond the walls of their workshops. Each loaf produced was a small but essential contribution to the stability of urban life, linking labor, economy, and governance in tangible form. Over time, the administration of grain supply and the organization of bakers evolved to mitigate recurring risks. Imperial warehouses expanded, oversight mechanisms became more structured, and guilds refined training, standards, and support for members. These adaptations reduced the frequency and severity of shortages, yet the fundamental interdependence of supply, labor, and social expectation remained. Bakers continued to occupy a unique position, essential providers of sustenance, intermediaries between citizens and state, and custodians of a craft imbued with both practical and symbolic significance. Reflecting on centuries of history, the narrative of Roman bakers and bread illustrates the profound connection between ordinary labor and urban stability. Each loaf, kneaded and baked with care, represented not only nourishment, but a tangible thread linking households, workshops, magistrates, and citizens. Riots and unrest, while often described as isolated incidents, were in reality predictable outcomes of systemic pressures, the vulnerabilities of supply, the weight of public expectation, and the visibility of labor. In understanding the role of bakers, one appreciates how seemingly mundane work sustains the social, economic, and political fabric of a city, demonstrating that the labor of daily life carries significance far beyond its immediate practical effect. Even as Rome entered the later centuries of the imperial period, the centrality of bread to urban life remained unchallenged. The city's population, concentrated in insular and crowded neighborhoods, depended on the reliability of daily rations. A single baker or a small workshop could influence the well-being of hundreds, illustrating the intricate interdependence of labor, supply, and civic stability. Grain imports from Africa, Sicily, and Egypt remained the backbone of sustenance, yet their arrival was subject to myriad uncertainties. Storms at sea, piracy, bureaucratic mismanagement, or regional unrest could delay shipments, leaving bakers to navigate crises of both production and public expectation. Bakeries, often family-run or organized within guild structures, adapted to these challenges through precise routines and careful coordination. Apprentices measured flour with meticulous accuracy, monitoring hydration and fermentation times to ensure consistency. The rhythmic pounding and folding of dough, the hum of activity, and the intense heat of wood-fired ovens created an environment that demanded both physical endurance and technical expertise. Flour dust coated skin, clothing, and hair, while the scent of yeast and freshly baked bread filled the workspace. Each loaf was a product of labor, experience, and careful judgment, representing the culmination of multiple factors working in concert to sustain urban life. Economic pressures were constant and multifaceted. Wheat prices fluctuated with harvest conditions and transport costs. Fuel for ovens required continual attention and expense, and laborers, apprentices, millers, and assistants needed consistent compensation. Price ceilings imposed by magistrates constrained revenue, requiring bakers to balance profitability against legal compliance and public expectation. Guilds offered guidance and advocacy, mediating disputes and standardizing methods, but could not entirely shield individual bakers from the effects of delayed shipments or market instability. These pressures made the act of baking a constant negotiation between material reality and social responsibility. Historical records provide vivid examples of how disruptions in supply affected both bakeries and citizens. During periods when shipments from Sicily or Africa were delayed, queues formed outside shops. Tension rose and public complaints reached the attention of magistrates. Emergency measures, release of stored grain, temporary expansions of oven capacity, and coordinated distribution were often necessary to prevent unrest. Bakers, positioned at the nexus of production and distribution, bore immediate responsibility for both nourishment and public satisfaction. Their labor, while practical and routine, assumed a role of profound civic importance. The social dimension of bread was equally significant. A consistent supply indicated effective governance and competent administration, while scarcity suggested neglect, mismanagement, or even political instability. Citizens interpreted shortages as social and political signals, experiencing hunger as a marker of the city's ability to maintain order. Bakers, aware of these perceptions, calibrated distribution, portion sizes, and timing to maintain equity and prevent disorder. The act of baking, therefore, carried a weight beyond mere sustenance. It was intertwined with the perception of social cohesion and governmental competence. Guilds evolved over time to address these challenges, refining training methods, codifying standards for quality and distribution, and advocating for members during disputes with magistrates. Apprentices learned not only the physical techniques of kneading, fermenting, and baking, but also the procedures for rationing and managing scarcity. The coordination of labor, combined with oversight from guilds and imperial authorities, created a network that mitigated the frequency and severity of shortages, yet could not entirely remove the risk. The system remained dependent on timely shipments, skilled labor, and the responsiveness of both bakers and officials. Bread riots, recurring across centuries, illustrate the stakes of these interdependencies. Citizens gathered at bakery doors when loaves were unavailable, sometimes escalating into protests or damage to property. Magistrates intervened, opening emergency stores, organizing temporary facilities, and dispatching guards to maintain order. Bakers, as visible intermediaries, were both the first point of contact for public frustration and the primary agents through which normalcy could be restored. The repetition of these patterns underscores the centrality of their labor. The social and political fabric of Rome depended on the reliable transformation of grain into bread. Daily life within bakeries reflected this precarious balance. Ovens radiated heat that could be oppressive. The smell of yeast and flour lingered on skin and clothing, and the rhythmic labor of kneading and shaping dough required precision and endurance. Senior bakers supervised apprentices, ensuring that fermentation, hydration, and baking were executed correctly. Each loaf had to meet expectations not only for quality, but for timely distribution, as the rhythms of urban life dictated that bread arrive consistently. Mistakes carried consequences for both the baker's livelihood and the social perception of governance. Even as administrative oversight improved, the fundamental interdependence of supply, labor, and social expectation persisted. A delay in a single shipment, a spike in fuel costs, or an error in rationing could cascade into visible unrest. Bakers, positioned at the intersection of these pressures, continued to play an indispensable role in urban life. Their labor represented the tangible interface between government infrastructure and daily sustenance, embodying a nexus of skill, responsibility, and civic importance that connected workshops to neighborhoods and magistrates to citizens alike. In reflecting on this long history, one sees that the story of Roman bakers is more than a tale of loaves and ovens. It is the story of labor deeply intertwined with social and political structures, of ordinary work carrying extraordinary significance. The rhythm of kneading and baking, the transformation of grain into sustenance, and the careful coordination of supply and distribution all contributed to the stability of one of history's greatest cities. Riots and unrest, while dramatic, were merely the surface manifestation of deeper systemic pressures, revealing the vital role that everyday labor played in maintaining civic life. In the neighborhoods surrounding the Forum, the pattern of bread distribution was tightly orchestrated. Bakers kept meticulous records of families, often maintaining ledgers that noted consumption and rationing history. The street smelled faintly of flour and ash, as wood-fired ovens vented smoke into narrow alleys. Children ran between stalls, sometimes impatiently tugging at parents while waiting for bread, their small hands brushing against sacks of flour stacked along shop walls. Apprentices carried baskets of freshly baked loaves from ovens to counters, their arms dusted white, moving with a rhythm honed over years of training. Senior bakers monitored the temperature of ovens with practiced touch, gauging the readiness of dough by feel, smell, and sight, adjusting heat levels carefully to prevent burning or undercooking. Each loaf was weighed and portioned, ensuring that even during shortages, the distribution appeared equitable. When shipments of wheat were delayed, the effects spread quickly. A merchant cart from Sicily, stuck in port or damaged by storm, meant a sudden decrease in flour stock, immediately felt by bakers who had already committed to daily quotas. Apprentices scrambled to adjust dough batches. Senior bakers recalculated the number of loaves to bake, and laborers carried heavier loads to stretch remaining supplies. The neighborhood felt tension in subtle ways. Doors opened more slowly as bakers and assistants negotiated rationing. Conversations at street corners whispered about scarcity. The smell of older loaves, slightly dried and hardened, became more noticeable as people hoarded what they had. Magistrates, aware of potential unrest, occasionally dispatched officials to monitor bakery activity, ensuring that rationing rules were enforced and that no one attempted to exploit shortages for personal profit. In wealthier districts, bakers faced different pressures. Large households demanded consistent loaves, often of higher quality, and maintained informal expectations of freshness and appearance. Bakers prepared dough with carefully sifted flour, sometimes blended from multiple grain sources, to ensure uniformity. Yeast was carefully maintained to produce the desired rise, and ovens were stoked with a precise amount of fuel to maintain steady heat. The air smelled faintly sweet, a mixture of flour and fermentation, and the rhythmic slap of dough against kneading boards echoed through workshops. Apprentices, learning under close supervision, absorbed not only the technical skills of bread making, but the social skill of managing client expectations, understanding which loaves went to which household, and how to maintain the trust of patrons during scarcity. In poorer districts, scarcity was felt more immediately. Loaves were smaller, sometimes coarse and heavy with bran, and bakers prioritized fairness, rationing carefully to avoid inflaming tensions. Apprentices moved quickly to shape and bake as much as possible with limited supplies, while senior bakers adjusted fermentation times and oven rotations to maximize yield. Streets near these workshops were filled with the mingled scent of smoke, yeasts, and earth from the flour, with citizens queuing patiently or anxiously, aware that each day's ration could vary. Disputes occasionally erupted, leading to complaints or gatherings outside shops, and magistrates had to intervene to prevent escalation. Each workshop acted as both production site and social checkpoint, where the labor of baking intersected with urban governance and community expectation. Guilds maintained oversight across districts, sending representatives to inspect workshop practices, ensure proper rationing, and provide guidance during shortages. Records were updated daily, noting the quantity of flour received, the number of loaves baked, and the distribution to various households. Apprentices were taught not only the craft, but also the administrative skills required to maintain these records, ensuring continuity in the event of a baker's absence. Coordination between guilds and magistrates allowed for rapid response when shipments were delayed. Yet even this system could not prevent temporary scarcity. Bakers navigated the delicate interplay between resource availability, labor management, and social obligation, with constant attention to detail, precision, and timing. Even minor incidents could ripple through neighborhoods. A cart overturned in transit, a miller delayed by equipment failure, or a miscalculation in rationing could quickly lead to complaints, tension, and even minor unrest. Bakers adjusted dough formulations, allocated smaller portions, and staggered baking times to maximize output while minimizing perception of inequity. Apprentices learned to anticipate the needs of both magistrates and citizens, calculating exactly how much bread would satisfy both groups and how to stretch limited flour without compromising basic standards. The work was continuous, physically demanding, and socially sensitive, with each loaf representing both sustenance and social coordination. When multiple districts faced simultaneous shortages, coordination between bakeries became essential. Guild representatives met in central halls, reviewing inventories and adjusting allocations. Flour was transferred between workshops to prevent complete depletion in any single neighborhood. Apprentices carried sacks through narrow streets, balancing weight and speed to maintain freshness, while senior bakers recalculated daily output to stretch supplies. Smoke from ovens mixed with the scent of yeast in the alleys, creating a pervasive aroma that marked both the labor and the scarcity. Citizens observed these movements closely, interpreting them as a measure of competence or, in cases of delay, evidence of failure. Bakers often had to innovate under pressure. In periods when fine wheat was unavailable, they incorporated coarser grains or bran to maintain loaf volume. The texture was denser, the flavor more robust, and the visual appearance less refined. Yet the loaves fulfilled the essential function of sustenance. Apprentices learned to mix water carefully to avoid overly stiff or slack dough, adjusting fermentation times to ensure proper rising. Each batch required exact attention, for errors could compound scarcity, creating dissatisfaction among citizens or scrutiny from officials. Even the timing of oven loading was critical. Batches had to finish at intervals that allowed continuous distribution, ensuring that no workshop exhausted its supply prematurely. Neighborhoods varied widely in their responses to scarcity. In wealthier areas, citizens sometimes tolerated minor inconsistencies in size or quality, but expected punctuality and reliability. Bakers serving these clients focused on maintaining loaf appearance and weight, measuring each one precisely and ensuring that distribution schedules were adhered to. In poorer districts, even small delays could provoke agitation. Citizens would queue for hours, sometimes forming informal committees to monitor fairness. Apprentices and laborers became skilled not only in production, but in negotiation, distributing loaves with an awareness of community dynamics and the perception of equity. The bakery was simultaneously a workshop, a social hub, and a site of civic observation. Magistrates relied heavily on the records maintained by guilds and bakers. Ledgers tracked the arrival of shipments, quantities baked, and households served. In emergencies, officials consulted these documents to decide where to deploy reserve grain or how to organize temporary baking facilities. These procedures became increasingly standardized over time, forming an administrative backbone that could respond quickly to crises while maintaining public trust. Bakers, in turn, adapted their labor routines to align with these administrative expectations, coordinating production with documentation and scheduling to ensure compliance and fairness. The physical labor remained demanding. Dough was kneaded by hand, pounded and folded repeatedly until it achieved the proper consistency. Ovens radiated dry heat, causing apprentices to sweat and dust to cling to skin and clothing. Senior bakers monitored temperatures with a practiced hand, judging readiness through smell, texture, and color. Bread had to be removed promptly and portioned accurately to meet rationing requirements, a process that required both precision and speed. Mistakes were visible immediately. A loaf overbaked or underrisen could not be sold, and its absence could spark complaints or unrest. The rhythm of the workshop was relentless, a combination of technical skill, physical endurance, and social coordination. During particularly severe shortages, bakers collaborated across neighborhoods, transferring dough, adjusting oven schedules, and sharing labor to maximize efficiency. Apprentices were dispatched to assist in multiple workshops, learning to adapt to different ovens, flour qualities, and local demands. Guild representatives oversaw these movements, ensuring compliance with rationing rules and preventing favoritism. Even the smallest errors, a miscounted loaf or uneven portion, could create tension, demonstrating the finely tuned interdependence of production, distribution, and social expectation. Bakers operated in a network that extended across streets and districts, connecting the labor of individual workshops to the sustenance of entire communities. Over time, patterns of scarcity and coordination informed long-term strategies. Guilds refined training, emphasizing not only technical skill, but logistical planning, record-keeping, and interpersonal negotiation. Officials developed contingency plans for delayed shipments, deploying temporary ovens and allocating reserves with greater precision. Bakers became adept at predicting demand fluctuations, adjusting production schedules, and managing both apprentices and laborers to maximize efficiency. The urban population, in turn, came to rely on these practices, experiencing bread not only as nourishment, but as a marker of civic stability, social fairness, and administrative competence. In certain years, Rome faced compounded crises when delayed shipments coincided with poor local harvests. Bakers in multiple districts had to coordinate rapidly, transferring flour and partially prepared dough between workshops to prevent complete depletion. Apprentices carried sacks across crowded streets, balancing weight and pace, while senior bakers recalculated oven schedules to maximize output. Smoke from wood-fired ovens mixed with the earthy scent of flour, filling the alleys with a tangible reminder of the labor underway. Citizens queued outside shops, listening for announcements from bakers regarding portion sizes and estimated availability. The visual and olfactory environment of these neighborhoods became intertwined with the rhythms of scarcity and production, each sensory cue reflecting both labor and civic consequence. Guild representatives convened frequently during these periods. They reviewed inventories, verified compliance with rationing rules, and coordinated emergency measures with magistrates. Ledgers detailed quantities received, loaves baked, and households served. Apprentices learned to interpret these records, understanding how documentation guided decisions about distribution and prioritization. When emergencies arose, temporary ovens were set up in open spaces, and bakers worked long hours to produce additional loaves. The careful coordination across districts, overseen by guilds and magistrates, prevented minor shortages from escalating into widespread unrest. Yet even the most organized responses could not entirely mitigate the stress on workshops and laborers. The sensory environment within workshops intensified during crises. Ovens emitted radiant heat that pressed against skin and clothing. Flour dust coated every surface, and the smell of fermenting dough grew stronger as larger batches were prepared. Apprentices moved in rhythm with the work, kneading and shaping dough, while senior bakers monitored consistency and temperature. Each loaf was measured precisely to meet rationing requirements, and timing was critical to ensure that no batch ran out before distribution. Mistakes were immediately apparent, and corrections had to be made swiftly to maintain supply and prevent dissatisfaction among citizens. Economic pressures compounded operational challenges. Flour costs fluctuated based on harvest yield, transport delays, and taxation. Fuel for ovens had to be rationed efficiently, and laborers required wages and sustenance. Price ceilings imposed by magistrates limited revenue, demanding careful calculation of both resource allocation and production schedules. Bakers continuously adjusted their labor, balancing the technical demands of baking with administrative oversight and social expectation. Apprentices absorbed these lessons, gaining experience not only in craft, but in planning, coordination, and crisis management. Neighborhood dynamics varied widely. In wealthier districts, bakers prioritized presentation and consistency, ensuring that loaves met expected weight and texture. In densely populated, poorer areas, quantity and equitable distribution were paramount. Queues extended along streets, and citizens observed the allocation of loaves closely, sometimes forming informal committees to monitor fairness. Bakers and apprentices developed an acute awareness of these social cues, adjusting portion sizes, batch timing, and distribution methods to maintain perceived equity. The bakery functioned simultaneously as a workshop, social hub, and civic interface, connecting labor with the daily lives and expectations of the urban population. Political intervention remained a constant presence. Magistrates monitored bakeries, ensuring compliance with rationing rules, preventing hoarding, and overseeing emergency measures. When shipments were delayed, officials authorized temporary baking facilities, coordinated grain transfers between districts, and dispatched guards to maintain order. Bakers, while focused on technical production, had to respond to these administrative instructions, integrating them into the daily workflow without disrupting output. The labor of baking, in this context, was inseparable from social coordination, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. Even small incidents could have cascading effects. A miscounted batch, a delayed delivery, or uneven loaf sizes could lead to public complaints and tension in the streets. Bakers adjusted formulations, staggered baking schedules, and redistributed resources to prevent escalation. Apprentices were trained to anticipate such issues, learning to respond quickly and maintain both production and social equilibrium. Each loaf became a link in a network of labor, administration, and public expectation, demonstrating the delicate balance required to sustain urban life. Through these recurrent crises, bakers, guilds, and magistrates developed increasingly sophisticated systems. Detailed records guided rationing, coordinated transfers minimized shortages, and temporary baking sites alleviated local pressure. Apprentices learned the full scope of responsibilities, from technical skill to social awareness and logistical planning. Workshops became microcosms of civic management, where the labor of transforming grain into bread connected directly to the stability and satisfaction of the city's residents. The process demanded precision, endurance, and coordination, a reflection of the broader systems that sustained Rome. During particularly harsh winters, the risk of shipment delays increased significantly. Ice and storms often obstructed river transport, while rough seas delayed shipments from North Africa and Sicily. Bakers responded by adjusting their daily routines. Dough hydration was altered to compensate for humidity. Ovens were stoked more frequently to maintain consistent temperature, and portions were calculated with extreme precision. Apprentices worked long hours, carrying baskets of dough between ovens, while senior bakers monitored fermentation and texture. Flour dust clung to every surface, mixing with smoke from wood fires and creating a haze that filled workshops, a constant reminder of both the intensity of labor and the scarcity of resources. In the poorer quarters, the strain was more immediately visible. Lines of citizens extended along narrow streets, waiting for rationed loaves that were often smaller and coarser than usual. Apprentices distributed bread carefully, balancing fairness with speed, while senior bakers coordinated batch sizes to stretch the limited flour supply. Complaints occasionally arose when portions appeared unequal, prompting quick intervention by guild representatives or neighborhood officials. Even minor miscalculations could generate tension, emphasizing the critical role bakers played in maintaining both nourishment and social stability. Wealthier households maintained different expectations. Loaves had to be visually uniform, with precise weight and texture. Bakers blended flours, managed yeast carefully, and monitored oven temperatures closely to ensure quality. Apprentices learned to balance these expectations with overall output, gaining experience in both technical skill and client management. Bread in these households was more than sustenance. It was a reflection of status and consistency, and any deviation in quality could prompt dissatisfaction or complaints to magistrates. Guild oversight remained central to managing scarcity and preventing unrest. Representatives conducted regular inspections, verified records, and mediated disputes. Ledgers meticulously tracked shipments, dough production, and household allocations. In times of shortage, guilds coordinated temporary transfers between workshops, allowing flour to move where it was most needed. Apprentices learned to interpret these records, understanding the administrative dimension of baking as a crucial component of their training. The coordination between guilds and magistrates allowed for rapid response to crises. Yet bakers still bore the immediate responsibility for production and distribution. Economic pressures compounded the operational challenges. Flour prices fluctuated, fuel for ovens required careful rationing, and laborers demanded wages. Price ceilings enforced by magistrates constrained profit, forcing bakers to maximize efficiency while adhering to regulations. Apprentices were trained to balance these pressures, learning to manage both technical and economic aspects of production. Senior bakers coordinated labor, monitored oven performance, and adjusted production schedules to maintain output and fairness, ensuring that the city's population continued to receive their daily sustenance despite external disruptions. Neighborhoods developed subtle systems of monitoring fairness. Citizens often observed distribution carefully, noting the size and quality of loaves, and occasionally forming informal committees to ensure equity. Bakers adapted to this scrutiny, adjusting portion sizes and timing to prevent disputes. Apprentices learned to anticipate tensions, distributing loaves in ways that minimized conflict and maintained public satisfaction. Each bakery operated as a microcosm of civic organization, linking labor, resources, and social observation in a continuous cycle of production and distribution. Even small disruptions demanded immediate attention. A delayed mill shipment, uneven dough consistency, or a slight oven malfunction could ripple through a workshop, requiring rapid adjustment. Apprentices responded by reallocating labor. Senior bakers recalculated batch sizes, and guild representatives monitored records for compliance. The interplay between technical skill, labor coordination, and social expectation defined the daily rhythm of the bakery. Smoke, heat, flour, and yeast remained constant, filling the air and marking the labor-intensive, socially significant work of sustaining a city. As spring approached, delayed shipments from Sicily and Africa finally arrived, bringing relief but also renewed labor for bakers. Flour was unloaded in bulk, weighed carefully, and distributed to workshops according to guild and magistrate records. Apprentices moved sacks along narrow streets, navigating uneven pavements and crowded alleys, while senior bakers immediately began calculating how much dough could be prepared and how to schedule oven use efficiently. The heat of the ovens, the scent of fresh dough, and the soft crackle of loaves cooling on wooden racks filled workshops with a familiar rhythm, signaling both labor and sustenance restored. Citizens queued with anticipation, noting the size and quality of the loaves, eager for the return to routine. In wealthier neighborhoods, bakers maintained careful attention to visual presentation. Loaves were scored evenly, crusts browned uniformly, and weight measured precisely. Apprentices learned to observe these details, understanding that quality carried social significance. In densely populated, poorer districts, emphasis remained on equitable distribution. Smaller loaves were allocated to households according to established records, and apprentices moved efficiently to deliver them while minimizing disputes. Guild representatives monitored both districts, verifying compliance with rationing procedures and ensuring fairness in distribution. Even after shortages ended, the work of bakers remained demanding. Ovens required constant attention. Kneading and shaping continued throughout the day, and fermentation schedules had to be monitored to maintain consistency. Flour dust lingered in the air, coating skin and clothing, while the aroma of baking bread permeated workshops and streets alike. Apprentices gained experience through these rhythms, learning not only technical skill, but also the social coordination necessary to sustain the urban population. Senior bakers balanced production, administrative oversight, and labor management, maintaining a delicate equilibrium that connected workshops to households and magistrates. Bakers' labor continued to intersect with civic oversight. Magistrates reviewed guild reports, inspected workshops, and verified that emergency measures were implemented correctly. Temporary ovens established during shortages were dismantled, and excess grain was stored for future use. Apprentices learned the procedures for reporting, record keeping, and inventory management, ensuring continuity in case of staff absence. The network of bakers, guilds, and officials functioned as an integrated system where the production of bread was inseparable from urban administration and social stability. Neighborhoods returned to a more predictable rhythm. Queues outside bakeries shortened. Citizens noted consistency in portion sizes and loaf quality, and minor disputes decreased as supply stabilized. The daily labor of baking continued with the same intensity as during shortages, yet with the added knowledge that effective coordination could prevent unrest. Workshops maintained records meticulously, ovens were monitored continuously, and apprentices practiced both technical skill and social awareness. The visible presence of labor, smell of bread, and orderly queues reinforced a sense of routine and civic reliability throughout the city. Across these events, the interconnectedness of supply, labor, and social expectation remained evident. Bakers transformed grain into sustenance. Apprentices learned precision and coordination. Guilds mediated operations and ensured compliance, and magistrates oversaw fairness and public order. Neighborhoods depended on this network, experiencing both physical nourishment and social continuity. Each loaf represented the culmination of careful labor, technical skill, logistical planning, and civic oversight, linking ordinary work to the broader stability of Rome. As daily routines stabilized, citizens resumed their normal activities, moving through streets scented with baking bread, observing the careful allocation of loaves, and appreciating the labor that sustained their households. Apprentices continued their training. Ovens glowed with steady heat, and flour dust remained suspended in the air. The city, having navigated scarcity and coordination, returned to its rhythm. Bakeries, guilds, and magistrates had demonstrated the effectiveness of structured labor and civic oversight, ensuring that each neighborhood received its daily sustenance and that the social fabric remained intact. The unbroken cycle of labor, distribution, and observation persisted, quietly sustaining Rome through centuries of growth, challenge, and change. The rhythm of ovens continued, apprentices moved with practiced precision, and bakers measured, kneaded, and shaped dough with care. Streets carried the scent of fresh loaves, and citizens received their rations with both gratitude and expectation. The labor of baking, once fraught with scarcity and crisis, had returned to its steady, indispensable role, connecting workshops, households, and civic administration in a network that sustained the city. Over centuries, this intricate system had ensured that bread remained both a necessity and a symbol of daily order, the work of bakers quietly underpinning the life of Rome.